The driving force of evolution is, of course, natural selection. But not everybody has historically agreed on what the actual unit of selection happens to be. Well, Darwinian natural selection is basically called individual selection. As I've described in another segment, individuals are competing for fluctuating resources, and the individuals that are best adapted to compete for those resources are the ones that will survive to reproduce. So basically, it's at the level of the individual organism. It's individual against individual, competing for fluctuating resources. That's Darwinian. But Richard Dawkins posited in his book, The Selfish Gene, which came out in 1977, another possibility, and he called it genic selection, where instead of the individuals battling it out among themselves, it's the genes within the individual. And it's best illustrated by looking at the foreign language versions of his book, where you can see here that we are mere wind-up toys to our genes, or our genes are pulling the puppet strings on the organisms. Samuel Butler, who was a novelist in the late 1800s, put it this way in one of his novels. Of course, this is before Richard Dawkins, but he wrote the phrase, "The hen is merely the egg's way of making another egg." That's the essence of what Richard Dawkins is actually saying. If we translate this into what Dawkins was saying, the organism is merely the gene's way of preserving the genes. In other words, it's the genes that are battling it out. Well, Dawkins is a pretty smart guy. This is all pretty much metaphorical. Literally, I can't imagine he really means that, but I can't speak for him. In any event, it's not really probably the best way of viewing what's going on in terms of selection. Well, the third and final possible unit of selection is, instead of individuals battling it out among themselves, it's groups of individuals that are actually the driving force. This is a view that was first posited by Wynne Edwards in 1962. He was faced with a dilemma, which is really what caused him to espouse this point of view. He said that if individual selection were the case, then of course you would see fluctuating population sizes, because individuals are battling it out among themselves, and so there might be some times when more might survive, other times where fewer might survive in relation to whatever resources happen to be available. But what he was observing, at least in some populations of animals, is that what didn't appear to be the case. That as resources fluctuated, so did the size of the group of animals that were around to capitalize on those resources. So they were always pretty well matched in terms of group size to the available resources, instead of the case with individual selection. So he said that selection would favor social behaviors that limit reproduction in order to avoid overexploitation of the available food resources. Social behaviors that serve to adjust the population size in accord with the available resources at that particular period of time. And these social behaviors are what he referred to as conventional rewards. It's not a term that's altogether obvious, but that's what the term that he used to refer to these various types of social behaviors. So in other words, selection would favor social behaviors that adjust population density at optimum levels in relation to fluctuating resources, basically what I just said. So the social behaviors that Wynne Edwards suggests are the ones that would serve to adjust population density in accord with fluctuating resources are territorial behavior, social dominance relationships. In other words, if there's a dominance hierarchy where only the highest members in the hierarchy are the ones that will be able to reproduce, as well as altruism, where you are sacrificing your own well-being for the benefit of others in the general vicinity. And we'll be talking about altruism in a separate module. So Basically, the essence of group selection is that a trait will evolve if reproductive restraint confers a reproductive advantage on the entire group, so that everybody decides that not everybody is going to reproduce. Now, not necessarily cognitively deciding. Again, if it's social dominance, then by default, only the most dominant individuals will be the ones to reproduce. So obviously not everybody's reproducing. If it's altruism, then perhaps the animals that are being altruistic are in fact putting themselves at risk and therefore may not survive to reproduce. So that will also tend to limit population size. And again, if selfish reproduction is disadvantageous to the group, then group selection was probably something that would kick in. Selfish reproduction meaning everybody is trying to reproduce, basically Darwinian selection, individual selection. The problem with group selection, I mean, in essence, there's really nothing wrong with it, but the problem with it is that it's not inconsistent with individual selection. It's totally consistent with individual selection. I mean, let's just look at territoriality for an example. Here we have a physical space, and we have different territories that have been mapped out, and so each territory has its own male. Well, because territoriality is occurring here, obviously that will limit the population size. And that would be the essence of group selection, where you're limiting the population size. But the reason this is consistent with individual selection is that each individual has exclusive rights to his territory. And so, there's food supply that's basically his, assuming that each individual is able to successfully defend his territory, and we'll just assume that that's the case. And, they have water supply, they have their own mate on their territory, and so on and so forth. So by being territorial, yes, you are limiting population size, but you're also benefiting yourself big time in terms of garnering the resources that are available on your territory. And the reason you're defending your territory in the first place is because there are resources there that require defending. So that is basically the rundown on units of selection.